You would never say to a friend what you say to yourself at 2 a.m. after a conversation that ended 6 hours ago. You would never tell a friend that their needs don't matter, that they should wait, that everyone else comes first, that the discomfort they caused by simply having a preference was somehow unforgivable. And yet, you know exactly what it feels like to say yes when everything inside you is saying no, to feel genuine guilt for putting yourself first, to apologize for things that weren't your fault, to watch yourself agree to something you didn't want and feel completely unable to stop it. Most people call this being nice. Some call it being a pushover. But neither of those explanations gets anywhere close to the truth. Because this isn't about niceness, and it isn't about willpower. It's about a program your nervous system learned to run decades ago in conditions that no longer exist. A program that protected you then and is quietly costing you now. Let's start with something most people never learn, because it reframes this entire pattern. You've heard of fight or flight, the basic stress biology. A threat is perceived. The nervous system activates. You either confront or escape. Most people also know about freeze, the third response, where the system becomes overwhelmed and goes still. What far fewer people know about is the fourth response. It was identified by therapist Pete Walker and later supported by trauma neuroscience. It's called the Fawn response, and it's the one that people pleasers know in their bodies, even if they've never heard the name. The Fawn response is the nervous system's fourth survival strategy. When fighting is too dangerous, fleeing isn't possible, and freezing isn't enough, the system tries one more option. Appease the threat, become agreeable, become useful, become exactly what the threatening person needs you to be, so they stop being dangerous. Here's the part that changes everything. Fawning is not a decision. Like fight, flight, and freeze, it is driven by the autonomic nervous system, the same system that controls your heartbeat and your breathing. You don't decide to fawn. Your body moves into it before your conscious mind has registered that a threat has been perceived. The yes forms in your throat before you've chosen it. The apology leaves your mouth before you've decided to apologize. Walker described it as a way to reduce the internal experience of fear and powerlessness by engaging in caretaking behaviors that lower the risk of aggression from the other person. In other words, your body learned that being helpful, agreeable, and small keeps you safer than any alternative. It learned this somewhere, and that somewhere is almost always early. The fawn response doesn't develop in a vacuum. It develops when a nervous system, a child's nervous system, learns a specific lesson. Expressing my needs is dangerous. This doesn't require obvious abuse. It doesn't require dramatic neglect. It happens in homes where love felt conditional, where approval came and went based on performance, where showing up with the wrong emotion, the wrong need, the wrong timing led to withdrawal, criticism, or something unpredictable, where the safest version of yourself was the one that made the adults around you comfortable. The child's nervous system is a learning machine. It runs an experiment hundreds of times. It notices the pattern. When I have needs, something bad happens. When I make others happy, I am safe, and it stores that pattern, not as a thought, as a bodily truth. This is why people pleasers often describe something that feels almost paradoxical. I know it's okay to say no. My body doesn't believe it. That's not confusion. That's not weakness. The belief isn't in the thoughts. It's in the nervous system. And the nervous system is older and faster than any conscious reasoning you can bring to a moment of conflict. But here's what most people never notice. Fawning was not a failure. For a child in a home where the source of danger and the source of love were the same person, fawning was the most sophisticated strategy available. It allowed connection with the people they depended on for survival while minimizing the threat those people posed. At the time, it was genuinely brilliant. The problem isn't that the strategy was wrong. The problem is that the nervous system never got the signal that the original conditions are gone. This is where most advice about people-pleasing breaks down completely. The advice is almost always behavioral. Set boundaries. Say no. Put yourself first. And it's not that those outcomes are wrong. They're exactly what emerges from a nervous system that feels safe. The problem is that they're being prescribed as causes when they're actually effects. You can't will your way to a different nervous system state. Here's what's actually happening in the body during a moment of potential conflict. The moment a relational threat is perceived, a conversation that might lead to disappointment, a request that might require you to say no, the threat detection system fires before the thinking brain has evaluated the situation. For a person with a fawn pattern, social disapproval is not perceived as inconvenience. It is perceived as danger. Because in the original context where this was learned, someone's displeasure genuinely did precede something painful. The nervous system cannot distinguish between a colleague being disappointed and an actual threat to safety. By the time your conscious mind has noticed that you wanted to say something different, you have already said something else. The apology has already been offered. The yes has already been sent. People pleasers often describe this with a particular kind of bewilderment. I watched myself agree to something I didn't want to do, and I couldn't stop it. They're not exaggerating. The response was genuinely faster than their conscious intention. And then, the guilt. The person who manages against this entire internal cascade to say no doesn't feel relief. They feel anxiety, guilt, and the sense that something terrible is about to happen. Because in the original environment where this pattern was learned, something often did. The nervous system keeps that record. It runs it forward into every new situation. It doesn't look dramatic from the outside, but it changes everything about how a person moves through their life. Let's be specific about what chronic fawning costs, because it isn't just emotional. Physically, the constant state of monitoring others, suppressing your own responses, running the appeasement protocol, it keeps the nervous system in sustained activation. The body never gets the signal that it's safe to rest. Cortisol stays elevated. Sleep is disrupted. The surveillance doesn't end when the conversation does. It continues through the night, replaying interactions, searching for what went wrong, trying to locate the source of a discomfort that doesn't have a clear address. Relationally, the fawn pattern tends to attract exactly what it fears, because people pleasers signal unlimited availability and suppressed needs. They are overrepresented in the support networks of people who take without giving back. Not because they're choosing badly, but because the nervous system that can't tolerate disappointing someone also can't name an imbalance when one is forming. And existentially, this is perhaps the deepest cost. When you have spent years editing yourself for every interaction, adjusting in real time to what everyone around you seems to need, you can lose track of who you actually are when no one is watching. What do you want? Separate from what would make someone else comfortable. People who have been fawning since childhood often describe a disorienting blankness when they first try to access that question. Not an answer they don't like. An absence. The practice of knowing was never developed because it never felt safe. There are two stories circulating widely about people-pleasing right now, and both of them miss something important. The first, that people-pleasing is manipulation, that by managing what you project, you're unconsciously controlling others. There's a grain of truth in it. The Fawn response does involve social management, but calling it manipulation is like calling freeze laziness. It names the behavior while completely misunderstanding its origin. A person running a survival response is not a manipulator. They are someone whose nervous system learned that managing the social environment was the only tool available for staying safe. The second, that people-pleasing is simply low self-worth, and the solution is to build confidence. This is also partially true, and also insufficient. You can have high conscious self-worth and still fawn automatically in moments of relational threat, because the fawn response operates below the level where self-worth conversations live. Mindset work that doesn't reach the nervous system leaves the pattern intact. Understanding this distinction matters because it changes the story you tell yourself about why this is happening. And that story is either "I am weak" or "I survived." One of those stories makes the pattern harder to change. The other makes it possible to approach with something other than contempt. So here's where this lands. The fawn response lives in the body. It was written there by repeated experience in early conditions that have likely been gone for years. It runs faster than thought. It protects you from a threat that no longer exists in the same form. And it is costing you in sleep, in relationships, in the quiet erosion of knowing what you actually want. That is not a character flaw. It is a nervous system doing exactly what it was trained to do. But here's what stays after everything else. You have spent years being generous with everyone around you, patient, accommodating, willing to adjust, to wait, to make room. You extended that to strangers, to colleagues, to people who didn't notice. You gave others without thinking what you have never been able to give yourself: the right to take up space, the right to have needs, the grace of not having to earn your place in a room. That capacity was never the problem. The only thing that was missing was the direction.